Hello, today we are talking about popular piety in medieval Europe. And in order to do this, I want to start with the commercial revolution. Around the year 1000, historians agree that the economy of Western Europe was starting to pick up. There's more trade, there's more specialization. We see more specialization. That means particular regions doing certain things, and more trade and more travel, more people traveling with goods as people take their goods, the wines produced in one region, and travel to a fair and trade it for the glass or salt or lead or wools that are woven or dyes that are made or spices that are imported or ceramics that are fired or olive oil that is harvested, et cetera, as they travel farther around Europe to acquire these at different fairs. And there's more fairs. Fairs happen periodically, maybe every month. Some fairs happen annually where people will gather from all types of from far distances to come together and trade wares. It was sort of a more flexible, less infrastructure alternative to having permanent stores. You know, the mall, the store was a brick and mortar business before internets came around, right? When this was maybe in a period where trade was emerging, as one historian put it, trade is leaving the margins. So many fiefs had been, and manors are, for the most part, self-sustaining. They don't need to go to the store because they make everything themselves, from candles to fabrics to the food they need to eat to the metal they need to forge. They would even often maybe have, if they had a source, they would create a salt distillery even. So the manor is in large part quite self-sufficient, and we're starting to see this period where there's more trade happening, but we're not maybe in a stage yet that's going to sustain a suburban mall, so to speak. That's a really anachronistic and bad analogy. But so instead you have these fairs that appear and disappear seasonally. So they're new, they're a sign of more vibrant commerce. Now, in the year 1050, for example, so there's more trade, more fairs. Then by the mid 11th century, it is clear that that description of a society where there are those who fought, those who tilled, and those who prayed no longer fits the bill, because there are more and more people that buy things and sell things and move things, as commerce is becoming a greater part of the world. Of course, in the year 1050, an observer would still see Western Europe as the backward end of Eurasia, compared with the Islamic world and the bustling commercial and educational centers of places like Aleppo or Cordoba on the Iberian Peninsula. Europe is an underdeveloped, rural, intellectually unsophisticated place. But while people didn't, even if it wasn't entirely apparent in the year 1050, in the long term, that medieval synthesis that we've talked about, this mix of the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, and Germanic cultures of Western Europe, would make a dramatic impact on Byzantium, on the Islamic world, as we talked about. And toward the end of our class, we'll see beyond the continent, the continents of Africa and Asia, the Afro-Eurasian ecumene, we might say, but even across distant oceans, and start to see an imperialism emerging by the early modern period. According to some historians, it's in these centuries, from the year 1000 to 1200, that those significant changes occur, that it's in these centuries that gets us from being northern barbarians to being Europeans. The historian R.I. Moore wrote a book he titled The First European Revolution. And in it, he said that in the 11th and 12th century, quote, Northwestern Europe went from being a peripheral region of the citied civilization based on the Mediterranean to being the seat of civilization in its own right. So if still the real action, the big cities, the really vibrant commerce is down around the Mediterranean and in the Near East, that will change. And we start to see the first glimmers that that might be a possibility with this commercial revolution that historians start to identify around the year 1000. The Carolingian Empire was a successor state. It had yet to develop permanent or characteristic forms of its own. In particular, it lacked urban life. And yet, that is what is about to change. And among the changes that are significant in terms of making Europe Europe, what are the ingredients? And people would say, well, there's institutions like monasteries, like universities, trade and fairs and towns where they developed commercial law, and churches that worked out canon law during these times. The study and practice of law, royal ways of behaving, from everything from courtly behavior to primogeniture. Are these all things that make Europe Europe? And so in the economic realm, some of these changes, although not particular to Europe, not particular. While not particular to Europe by any means, we are seeing on the continent in these centuries, which will only be exacerbated by and after the Black Death, of course, new divisions of labor, changes in social relations and the way economies are organized, etc. And this is what we refer to as the commercial revolution. And people may quibble on the dates, but about 1000 to 1150 is a good, or 10,000 to 1200 in these centuries is what's referred to as kind of that medieval commercial revolution. And one of the most striking features during this time is the rise of a money economy in Western Europe. If you recall, we talked about coinage, and Rome had begun minting coins in 289 before Common Era. So 3rd century Common Era, coins facilitate commerce in wonderful ways and replace barter. As the Roman Empire devolved, we had seen a return to barter. Gold coins ceased to be minted in Eastern Europe as a result of, with Muslim invasions on the edges, gold is less accessible, commerce declines anyway, and so gold coins aren't minted at all until, actually they won't be reminted until the 13th century. So in the middle of the 1200s, Florence and Italy will start minting gold coins again. But around this year 1000, we see a lot more minting of silver coins. So money, currency is coming back into play to a greater extent, and it's an indication that there is a quickening in commerce that's on the rise. With the commercial revolution, there will be all sorts of changes. We will see more of an urban environment. We will see more guilds. With more of an urban environment, we see the development of different types of governance, town charters and burghers running towns, and they make deals with kings and royalty. We see the emergence of universities that are doing more than just educating people for the clerics, because merchants also have good reasons to have literacy and numeracy. And so all of these, this is a quickening that takes place with the medieval era. Next time, we'll talk more about that urbanization. But what I want to do for the most part today is talk about popular piety. We've talked a lot about church institutions and the papacy. Like I kind of began talking about the Crusades around the papacy. After all, the call comes from the papacy, and it's in many, and we see a papacy asserting itself even as it's struggling with secular powers, right? Those are some of the big themes that we're keeping our eyes on during in this course. You know, how do we get from a theocratic world to a world that separates church and state, right? We're keeping our eyes on this ball. But instead of talking about the high papacy, we'll return to that in a different lecture. I want to talk about popular piety, kind of lower down on the social rungs, and how did people whose thoughts we can have some glimpse into because sources are there for us, how did they experience their faith? And so that leads me to talk about here's a kind of map of sort of emerging states in the medieval empire. But I want to talk about the monastic orders. I want to talk about certain monastic orders. I want to put on your radar screen this thing called lay piety and what do we mean by it. And I want you to keep the papacy in the background because I'm going to get to heresies, and we'll see how the church is there attempting to police the faith, and drawing those boundaries on what's in, what counts as the good faith, and what counts as a deviation from the faith or a heresy. So when we started to talk about Christianity and how it spread, one of the things I suggested to you is that monastic orders are a powerful vehicle for the spread of Christianity and for organizing society, because they're sort of this blueprint that you get together some monks and they have an order that they follow. The Benedictine order was a 6th century kind of rule that was the recipe, so to speak, for how people that want to cloister together away from the rest of the world and devote themselves to God, how they would organize their days, when they'll pray, what they'll pray. And so the Benedictine rule was sort of was a very common rule, and monasteries are founded all throughout European space, and I kind of think of it as just kind of stamping and replicating this way of organizing life. And you might keep that in mind if in your final exam you're asked, what makes Europe European? Is there something that we should legitimately call a European identity? And if so, what contributed to it? Well, I think that sort of that monastic model of living would be part of your answer. So the Benedictine order the Benedictine rule is the rule or recipe for organizing the days of many that spreads broadly. It's composed of 73 chapters, and monks take vows of poverty, chastity, obedience initially. And as monasteries spread, many monasteries become quite wealthy. One of the reasons they become wealthy is because wealthier people that are Christians and seeking salvation in God's favor would often gift their lands and wealth to monasteries to support prayers for themselves. And then they acquire land, and they devote, and many monasteries devoted themselves to a type of work, often agricultural work. We'll talk about the Cistercians as a prime example of that. And they became wealthier through this work. Monasteries are also forms of social welfare. They perform do work of producing agriculture. They have services in parishes to tend to the flock. They have clerics, and they also provide social welfare to people in the communities that need it. But gradually, many monasteries in Europe become quite wealthy, and they maybe have even more ornate ways of being. They have splendid, ornate churches that, according to some, maybe lose that emphasis on poverty that was a real part of so many, an initial monastic movement. Now, all monasteries are not exactly the same, and this is what I'm going to kind of start to be talking about here, is that you have different emphases. Maybe some some monasteries, for example, take vows of silence. They don't talk at all, they just devote themselves to prayer, that their voices and conversation might distract them from a focus on salvation and the Lord. Some monasteries devote themselves to copying. All monasteries will have some sort of scriptoria, but others are more dedicated to it. Now, one very successful monastic order is the Cluniac order. It's established in the year 910. And it's established as the result of monks who are interested in reforming, doing things a little bit better, but it gets quite wealthy. And it was, and many came to see it as a bit too much fat living and having too much property, as opposed to, and not enough renunciation of the body and the world. And so then you would have other monasteries being founded with a different emphasis. The Carthusian order, founded by Bruno in Cologne, which is Germany, is founded in 1084. And these are the monks that took vows of silence. They would copy manuscripts. They had a rule where there were 12 monks in a monastery. And then when they grew, they would form a new monastery rather than getting so big. Another monastery that is formed in Another monastery that gets formed that I want to talk to you about is the Cistercian order. And the Cistercian order is formed by a Bernard of Clairvaux from France, who is later sainted, so Saint Bernard, and he lives around the 11th into the first half of the 12th century. This order is established in 1098. So just a couple of years after the call for the Crusades, in this very kind of ascendant moment. It technically followed the Benedictine rule, but the Cistercian order very much emphasized the humanity of Jesus. And it was also founded on ideas of simplicity and poverty, that they too are going to kind of return to those roots, renouncing things of this world and embrace poverty. And it took work as a virtue. Remember back to our Greeks at the forums? It was wonderful to do athletics and pursue excellence. It was wonderful to pursue excellence in arete and become some wonderful athlete, and it was wonderful to be wealthy, but it was not good to work and engage in menial labor. The Cistercians and in Christianity in general, they changed that vibe. And the Cistercians essentially, especially, see work as a virtue, that sort of devoting oneself in some humble, repeated activities, submission, obedience, humility, work as virtue. And lo and behold, the Cistercians so dedicate themselves to work that they have some of the most successful farm production in medieval Europe, and they become quite wealthy as well. Here is an example of some productive fields and Cistercian churches, and they built beautiful big churches, and they also did copying, as is always the case. And their work ethic of reclaiming land and building irrigation that is productive and efficient is so successful that they develop networks that spread wide. They incorporate lay brother workers. They call these people conversi. And some historians look at this, and if you don't look at the religious component, you really see what a manifestation of the commercial revolution. One historian who studied the economic life surrounding Cistercian monasteries in Burgundy described them as holy entrepreneurs. Said Gerald of Wales, a contemporary about the Cistercians, he said, quote, "Settle the Cistercians in some barren retreat which is hidden away in an overgrown forest. A year or two later, you will find splendid churches there and fine monastic buildings with a great amount of property and all the wealth you can imagine." The Cistercians, in particular, they had a particular relationship to nature, and they thought that they understood themselves to be kind of restoring a type of paradise by taming and making beautiful and productive God's creation. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote the following. He wrote, The cloister is a true paradise, and the surrounding countryside shares in its dignity. Nature in the raw, unembellished by work or art, inspires the learned man with a sort of horror. The abysses and peaks which we like to gaze at are to him an occasion of fear. A wild spot not hallowed by prayer and asceticism, and which is not the scene of any spiritual life, is, as it were, in the state of original sin. But once it has become fertile and purposeful, it takes on the utmost significance. So there you have this statement fusing what you see in nature with spirituality, that just sort of wilderness untouched by man is in a state of original sin. But to take the untamed forest and to clear it and irrigate it and make it productive, this is to do honor to God. And so that is very much what the Cistercians did all over Europe, and clearing land, making farmland productive, and taming landscape was very much its goal. And we see in the Cistercians these ideas of work, innovation, efficient irrigation to better water their fields and utilize resources, ideas of progress. And it turns out that work, innovation, progress, when we talk about Western values and even modern values, those make the list. And so do we see that sort of example in the Cistercians? When the Black Death hit, scholars say Europe was overpopulated, that all the available land was cultivated, and it was maxing out on production. That's debatable, but the Cistercians certainly played a role in bringing those arable lands online with very active deforestation, which they called land reclamation. And there's a certain irony there, as in land reclaiming land that hadn't been previously farmed, but nonetheless, land reclamation is what we call it. As one historian put it, and here's a quote: Cistercians exemplified what became a standard Latin Christian ideal, that the idea that advancing technology was an aspect of high spirituality. So that's a bit about the Cistercians. But now I want to talk about some other orders that are called mendicant orders. And the mendicant orders are an alternative to the cloister orders, that cloisters being the people that decided, I am going to separate myself from the world and live in a spiritual community. So I'm not going to be completely a hermit. I'm going to be cenobitic. I'm going to live in a spiritual community that is, however, removed from the rest of the world. And that's sort of cloistered monasticism. Well, mendicant orders had a different idea, and their idea was we should mix with the world. We should be in there with the people and helping people in urban places. And some historians say it's a result of this, it's in the context, if not, it's not because of cities, but it is with emerging cities that we see this sort of a manifestation of popular piety, and this desire to not be removed from the world, but to do God's work in the world. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the mendicant orders. And one of the most famous of these, and I suspect, if you're Catholic, you've certainly heard of Saint Francis of Assisi, who founded the Franciscan order. Francis of Assisi lived probably from 1182 to 1226. So it's centuries after the First Crusade. And here's an image of him that's the image on the left is a common modern representation. But here in the lower view is a more historic manuscript illustration of him feeding some birds, and it looks like maybe some ducks there as well. And Francis is very much associated with animals and nature. But who was Francis? So Francis was the son of a wealthy merchant. He'd served in the army and was on his way to having a quite successful career. Around the year 1205, however, he had revelations that led him to want to both be a monk, but he wanted to reject the shelter of the cloister. And what he wanted to do was preach in towns and serve the poor. He wanted to work manually, and he wanted to minister. One second, let me. So Francis decides, doesn't want to be a merchant, doesn't want to be a soldier, doesn't want to be a cloistered monk. He wants to go out into the cities. He wants to minister to the poor. He wants to minister to lepers. He wants to do nothing to shore up his own security. He wants to live off the charity of others. He wants to live by begging, kind of assuming that ultimate role of humility. He begins as a layperson. He's not ordained. He goes out into the streets and he starts doing this. In around the year 1210, he goes before Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent III was Pope from 1198 to 1216. So it was on his watch that infamous Fourth Crusade, where the Catholics took the Orthodox Constantinople, another Christian city. Anyway, he goes before Pope Innocent III, and who had also sent monks into southern France to combat heresy. And Francis asks for permission and the blessing of the Pope to found an order. And he gets that permission, provided that all of the people that will minister to the poor and take these vows of poverty, following Francis of Assisi's example, they would accept monastic tonsure, and all Franciscans would have that ritual haircut signifying submission that you see here in this image, kind of identifying who they were. And so Francis of Assisi was a tremendously charismatic individual, and he founds what becomes a tremendously successful mendicant order. And even I grew up in towns, and I would visit aunts where there would be, the akin to maybe a Salvation Army, St. Francis of Assisi shop that would minister to people in their neighborhood or whatnot. At any rate, St. Francis of Assisi, the other thing to know about him is that he had great regard for the natural world and nature. He even, in his life, his vita, he would preach to fish and flowers. Birds would alight on his arms. He praised the natural beauty of God's creation regularly, and his admiration reportedly extended to the inanimate world as well. He even once admonished a brother not to hurt stones or to hurt fire. So you wonder, what is the mindset here? He's been associated with a Near Eastern doctrine that's known as ahimsa, which is the renunciation of the will to hurt or kill any living thing. He rarely ate meat, perhaps not so much that he was a vegetarian as much as he was an ascetic, very much about denying the body more than being exclusively focused on not eating meat. But the point was to deprive himself and deprive the body, and thereby fortify the spirit. He wrote poems, and one of his poems, Praises of Virtue, he wrote, "Obedience subjects a man to everyone on earth, and not only to men, but also to all the beasts as well, and to the wild animals." It's phrases like this, to subject a man to all the beasts as well as to all the wild animals, has led some to wonder if St. Francis wasn't indeed the first Christian environmentalist, or if he might have been a little bit out of line with orthodoxy. And he has a poem with canticle from the Canticle of Brother Sun that, depending on how you translate some of those Latin Italianate prepositions, can sound a little bit paganish. I'll leave that. I'll leave that for now. So that's the Assisis. Now I want to talk about a little bit about some other movements that get founded. We'll talk a little bit more about those in order to combat heresy. The Dominican order is an order that is founded in order to fight what's perceived as a heresy, the Albigensians, that is identified in southern France in the early 13th century. And it's founded by a Dominic Guzman, who is of Castile, which is on the now Spain. And Dominic lives 1170 to 1221. He was a Spanish nobleman who himself reacted against the lavish missionaries that the church sent and kind of was seeking something different, caught the attention of the Pope and Dominican friars. They embraced poverty as well as a central part of their calling or vocation and preached, but they were also very much dedicated to teaching correct doctrine. So they went out to fight heresies, not with not with swords, but with their Bibles and with a deep knowledge of the sacraments, and that they were going to make sure you understood what the faith was. While I'm naming orders, you've probably all heard of the Jesuit order. This is an order founded by another Spaniard, Ignatius of Loyola, Spanish monk, but it's founded in the 16th century. So it's centuries away from the time we're talking about now. All of these, so the Franciscans, the Franciscans, very much founded on this notion of embracing poverty, and that's something we see again and again in these this impulse to reform, that somehow we've gotten away from our more simplistic roots of poverty, a little bit too lavish. Let's return anew, found something new dedicated to that principle. And then the Dominicans a bit also very much dedicated to, let's make sure we're getting right doctrine out there, because there's problems. There's a lot of wrong doctrine that's spreading, and we need to do the work of spreading right doctrine. Now, I'm going to come back to heresies a little bit, but I want to touch on some other manifestations of piety. So popular piety, just how various people live their faith. And here I want to talk about lay movements. So by lay, when I say lay people, lay person, that means someone that hasn't been ordained into the church, be it a monk or a priest, different types of clergy or clerical roles. These are people that haven't received holy orders, that's the sacrament to become a priest, but nonetheless are so moved by their faith that they kind of live their life in a way that's recognizable. And the Beguines are a fascinating example of a movement of lay piety. The Beguines emerge in the 12th century in the Low Countries, these wool producing countries up in the Netherlands and Belgium. And it's founded by women. It emerged, so it emerges in what's now the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, the northern tip of France, on the Rhine Delta. And these Low Countries are a crucial part of medieval Europe. They're the centers of cloth production, one of Europe's most highly urbanized regions, along with northern Italy. And it's a crossroads for political, religious, intellectual currents, as well as for trade. The movement begins there, later spreads to very different parts of Europe. It's quite diverse. There's no central authority. Often these women would come together in communities where they work as weavers, or they work they work as the weavers. They support themselves doing some sort of work in this commercial community, and the wool industry, textiles are huge there in the Low Countries. And then they also serve and minister to the sick and the poor in their communities. They lived in commune together, and they made some male leaders and burghers and the municipal authorities sometimes quite nervous. What are all these women just living together without a man, ruling over them as the father of a there were male monasteries and female monasteries, and every female monastery had a main abbess, but they were always overseen by a male abbot or bishop or whatnot. And these Beguines live without that sort of male authority over them. And so they made people nervous, but they were tolerated. They didn't even, and they didn't kind of recognize in their daily lives the authority of the church hierarchy, which it did, some points did get them in trouble. So they're a fascinating example of kind of grassroots lay piety. While we're talking about women, let's just pause a little bit to talk about, to round out this picture of emerging piety by mentioning movements that didn't necessarily receive the, or form into the same types of groups or receive the same public sanction. And I want to mention this woman, Angela of Foligno. She was a woman who became so devoted to the Eucharist that was all she wanted to put in her body and consume, and as a way of expressing her devotion to Christ. And other historians have consequently come along and said, you know, is this extreme devotion that manifests in this asceticism so extreme that these women, and she wasn't the only one that wouldn't eat? Are we seeing a medieval version of anorexia? I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I just want to put this on your radar screen to say, and it opens up these big questions about, hey, can we take a modern disease and apply it back in distant time? Now, with something like plague and the Black Death, as you are learning about and reading about right now, the research is moving along, what they can do with DNA, and taking, you know, artifacts from the past and putting them and doing whatever they do to them in labs, and really identifying the makeup of diseases to diagnose. That is real work that is happening, and it's a fascinating example of how technology is changing our understanding of the past. This is a different can of worms, so to speak, because now we're talking about diseases, illnesses that fall in the category of psychology, and what's normal in psychology to know what's abnormal, right? There's a historical spectrum here that's really fascinating to stop and think about it. One of the things we say about the past, I mean, one of the reasons, or two of the reasons to understand the past, are to understand both how alike maybe some people in the past were to us, but also to understand how different they were from us. And so many historians are really uncomfortable with the idea of saying, hey, you can't, the DMS, or the Diagnostic Manual of Modern Psychological Conditions, you can't just kind of take down that dictionary and apply it to someone to the past. While other historians say, well, hey, wait a second, if it acts like a duck and talks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. This is a, I would say, controversial area of history, but maybe some of you out there will jump into that fray and try and come up with answers to those kinds of questions about what we can know, and about those very distant mindsets and how we might diagnose people. Female mystics also appear in the Middle Ages. When we say mystical, a mystic is someone that has a sensory emotional experience. That is, they feel like they have some connection to something metaphysical, not through deep study or some kind of external thing, or maybe some metaphysical thing, but yeah, mystical experience is characterized by sensory emotional experience. Now, the physical manifestations of mystical experience tend to be not so different from the physical manifestations of demonic possession. And therein lies a big problem and danger, so to speak, in determining the source and identifying what is an authentic divine experience. Is God talking to you, or is the devil talking to you? And so this was something that was quite fraught for medieval women mystics. Some of them emerged quite successful and famous, and one thing we know is that they pretty much had to have a confessor, or or a male supervisor that was their advocate and sponsor in order to succeed at that. One woman who did succeed at that is Hildegard of Bingen, and she lived so she was born 1098, so around the time of the First Crusade, and when the the Cistercians are being founded by Bernard of Clairvaux, and then dies in 1179. She was the Benedictine abbotess, so not lay. She, took orders and is a religious woman, but took her confessor, had visions and wrote and drew, and she was a preacher, which is quite a rarity, and a musician, and recognized as a mystic, recognized as someone having an authentic mystical experience, divinely inspired. And she was very respected by her contemporaries. Another very famous woman, and in her own day recognized as a distinguished figure, was a Catherine of Siena. She's a later figure. She lives in the 1300s, and she was a devout woman who had visions of what God was asking her to do, practiced extreme asceticism, focused solely on Christ. She described herself in a mystical marriage with Christ. She wrote letters to others, imploring them to practice their faith. Hundreds of these letters survive. She was also interested in uniting the church that had been sundered. That effort didn't succeed. She wasn't alone in trying, but she was an authoritative voice in that discussion, largely and thanks to her confessor, the guy that she goes to confession and tells her sins to. That's Raymond of Capua. But Catherine of Siena is also one of these, a woman that the historian Carolyn Walker Bynum, a very distinguished medieval historian, discussed in her book, Holy Feast, Holy Fast. And she talks about Catherine's radical fasting regime. For some women mystics, radical fasting became the preparation for the reception of the Eucharist, and they often described it in highly emotional, even erotic terms. After a long period of fasting, one woman, Lucardis, had a vision in which Christ appeared to her as a handsome youth and blew into her mouth. She wrote, she was infused with such sweetness and inner fruition that she felt as if drunk. From the age of 23, Catherine of Siena subsisted, we're told in her Vita, entirely on the Eucharist, cold water, and bitter herbs that she would suck and spit out. She only wanted the Eucharist to go into her body, and almost. She wrote of the importance of the Eucharist, that we must attach ourselves to the breast of Christ crucified, which is the source of charity, and by means of that flesh, we draw milk. In some ways, Catherine of Siena maybe is someone we might point to if we were looking at changing standards of piety over time. This is something I talked about before in the way Jesus has been represented over time. Well, by the time we get to figures like Mother Teresa, for example, the standard for a woman's saintliness is charity, is caring for others. And it's even more important than their devotion to Christ. But yet in the Vita of Catherine of Siena, we see her being kind of celebrated for going into these trances, one of which a nearby child falls into a fire and she doesn't notice because she is so devoted to Jesus. And I would just sort of point that out to you that later women that get honored by the church for their piety are generally honored for caring for others, not just their own mystical trance that they might be in. Now, so for some of these women, fasting and devotion to the Eucharist did not mean rejection of the body, but rather were attempts to use their senses to perfect a perfect union with God. And they considered that God for them was their nourishment entirely. Now, so those are a few words about some of the variety of ways in which we see piety, faith being acted out in medieval Europe. Now I want to turn a little bit to heresies. So I've kind of listed some different orders that had different emphases in their practice, from vows of silence and copying to farming well, to going into urban places and ministering to the poor, to women like beguines that were lay women. And these people had the sanction and blessing of the church for the most part. Little more complicated with the beguines, but for the most part, they have the blessing of the church. And then other people, however, in the medieval period, don't have that same blessing. And so here's some examples of those are the Waldensians and the Cathars, or the Albigensians. And these are groups of people that are deemed heretics. So the Waldensians, founded by somewhat mythical, but historians are pretty sure these individual, if his name wasn't Waldo, a rich merchant, turned a lay preacher in around Lyon, France in the 1170s, given a name Waldo. And by the way, there's a theme here, as with Muhammad, as with Francis of Assisi, so too with Waldo, that you have kind of a wealthy merchant who decides to reject the commercial path and devote themselves to a more spiritual life of poverty. Well, he and his followers begin doing, engaging in lay preaching, much as Saint Francis, he's not a saint during his life, much as Francis of Assisi had, but they're condemned. In the Synod of Verona in 1184, they're expelled from the church, even as in creed, in what they're believing and what they're doing, they're not so different from what the Franciscans are doing. But the Waldensians insisting on preaching as well. I mean, here's the rub. Francis agreed to just minister in that utter humility and obedience and submission to help others. The Waldensians wanted to preach as well without being ordained. That was a no-go, a bridge too far for the church. And so they're perceived as a threat to papal authority, to potentially the integrity of the theology. And so even though Waldo was speaking, words from the Gospel of Matthew, when he said, if you wish to be perfect, then go and sell everything you have and give to the poor. But the church is not interested in kind of having lay preachers about. The serving they can tolerate, but not preaching. And this is in this age of the church kind of trying to establish and own its authority. And part of those reforms, we talked about the Gregorian reforms, part of those reforms are running a tighter ship in terms of having a clergy that know the doctrine and can preach it appropriately and know the sacraments and administer them properly and can really be good shepherds to the flock. One of the results of that work of making sure that the clergy and the kind of soldiers of Christ in the clerical sense know their work is a deepening gulf between the priest and the parishioner. I say that because when the Reformation comes around, one of the real impulses there is, hey, what's this? What's all this hierarchy and distance? Aren't we all children of God? Moving on, the Cathars are another. In the 12th century, they emerge and are deemed heretics. They have obscure origins that might go back to Gnosticism and even the Manichaeism of the classical world. This philosophy that there is the material world is evil and the spiritual metaphysical world is where good resides, and that the world is entirely a struggle between these two forces, that their ideas held that the devil had created the material world, and so they reject wealth and sex and meat, and they're deemed heretical. They are also in southern France, in one region of southern France, Cathars start to be called Albigensians, and they're deemed particularly troublesome. There's a lot of nobility in their ranks, and this happens to be and so the church is particularly worried that you have people with wealth and castles that are very much embracing this flavor of spirituality, and that has implications for bringing wayward worshipers into the church's fold. And so it's really the Albigensians that motivate Pope Innocent III, I mentioned him before, to conduct the Albigensian Crusade, which goes on from 1209 to 1229, to fight against these heretics and get them to denounce this heresy, or even be fought with. And the Dominican order is founded in 1216 to go and combat this heresy on the educational side of things. Now, I mentioned Pope Innocent III, and I'm gonna end with him as with a preview to next time. Here is a manuscript picture of him, both Pope Innocent III excommunicating the Albigensians on the left, and then a massacre of Albigensians by the Crusaders on the right. Now let me end with the Fourth Lateran Council. Innocent III, very much we can see him as part of this effort of the church asserting its authority both in the world and in a spiritual sense. And part of asserting authority in that spiritual sense is policing the faith, making sure you have the theology correct. And in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council is held, a really big meeting coming together to kind of, make decisions about the faith and the practice of it. And at the Fourth Lateran Council, several important things happen. It's convened by Innocent III. It establishes the Inquisition as a church institution that is going to combat heresy. And it'll become permanent in 1233, but this is kind of saying there's a lot of wrong belief out there, and it is our job to find it, route it out, and make sure people believe correctly, and even discipline them if they believe incorrectly. As time goes on, the Inquisition will get more violent. The stakes are bigger. Earlier on, if you were found to be misbelief, you might just have kind of a bigger penance, say lots of Hail Marys, and then maybe, being in prison for some days or something. It's not initially the kind of fatal Inquisition that we see in 16th century Spain, for example. But the Inquisition is as an institution to rout out heresy is founded at the Fourth Lateran Council. The doctrine of transubstantiation is also declared the true faith and belief at this council. And the doctrine of transubstantiation is this idea that if you're religious, that at the time when you take the Eucharist, you are a priest in this moment of transubstantiation has turned what was just bread into the real flesh of Christ. It's a miracle. You're not supposed to understand it. It gets harder and harder to believe with scientific methods at our disposal. But in any way, people had been, talking about this for a long, long time, a millennium. and at the Fourth Lateran Council, they said, yes, the Eucharist, actually, it's a miracle. It changes into the real body of Christ. You've got to believe it to be a good Christian. This sends out ripples of concern. And when we have the Reformation, you're going to have some people that say, you know what, actually, I'm not so on board with that transubstantiation thing. It's at the Fourth Lateran Council, they also say the sacraments must be observed and they need to be ordained by, they need to be administered by an ordained priest. Your midwife can't baptize a baby or marry someone. It needs to be a priest that does these sorts of sacred rituals. And finally, and this will pick up when we talk about next time, the Fourth Lateran Council decrees that Jews must wear separate clothing. And here is, I'll end with a quote from the canon of the Fourth Lateran Council, which read, "In the countries where Christians do not distinguish themselves from Jews or Saracens by their garments, relations are maintained between Christians and Jews or Saracens, or vice versa. In order that such wickedness in the future not be excused by error, it is decreed that henceforth Jews of both sexes will be distinguished from other peoples by their garments, as moreover has been prescribed unto them by Moses. They will not show themselves in public during Holy Week, for some among them on these days wear their finest garments and mock the Christians clad in mourning. Trespassers will be duly punished by the secular powers in order that they no longer dare flout Christ in the presence of Christians." End quote. So Jews being forced to wear a star to distinguish themselves in 20th century Germany actually has far earlier antecedents. But in that confusing passage I just read to you, one of the things that we need to get a handle on to make sense of is what's been going on in Iberia. And so the next time we'll return to the increasing urbanization of the medieval period. We'll talk about the emergence of anti-Semitism, and we'll talk some about Iberia and the Reconquista. All right, until next time.